Hello everybody, hope you're doing well this Tuesday afternoon. We've got a little bit of sunshine out there, so I hope you're able to enjoy that. I wanted to begin today by asking you a question, and that question is, do you remember what your first job was? I remember what my first job was. I worked at an Arthur Treacher's fish and chips restaurant. Maybe you remember Arthur Treacher's. Well, I had just turned 16 and started working at Arthur Treacher's, and at that time there were two Arthur Treacher's in my town. One was on the west side of town, the other one was on the east side of town, and I started the one on the west side of town. I didn't have my driver's license yet. I didn't have a car yet. So in order for me to get to work, I had to walk. And Arthur Treacher's on the west side of town was about a 2.5-mile walk for me. But I did that. In fact, I did that probably for the next 3 months until sometime around June the 1st, my boss came to me and said, "Hey, we would like you to start working at our east side location. They need some help over there." I didn't think anything of it, no big deal to me. So I said, sure. Well, I soon discovered that that east side location, well, that was about a 4-mile walk for me, rather than the 2.5 miles that I'd been walking. Not only was it a 4-mile walk, but I also had to walk through kind of a bad part of town to get there. And I did. I started working at that east side location, and I soon met a young lady who was my age. She was 16. She was one of our cashiers, and I discovered pretty quickly that she was a Christian. She would talk about God, she would talk about Jesus, talk about the Bible, talk about her church. And I have to tell you something. I wasn't a very good person at that time. So when she started talking about God, I would make fun of her. When she'd start talking about Jesus, I would ridicule her. When she'd start talking about the Bible or her church, I would berate her. But you know what? It never stopped her. She never stopped talking about God. Well, this went on probably for 6 months or so. And then finally, sometime around the 7th month, the things that she had been saying about God began to make sense to me. And I embraced faith myself. I became a Christian after about 7 months. I have a story today I want to talk about. It's found in John's Gospel, the 11th chapter. It's about a man named Lazarus, about his death and his resurrection. Maybe you've heard of Lazarus. Well, Lazarus, he has 2 sisters, Mary and Martha, and the 3 of them, they're good friends with Jesus. One day, Lazarus gets sick. It must have been pretty bad because his 2 sisters send a message to Jesus asking Jesus to come and heal him. Well, Jesus sends a message back to the sisters, and he assures them that this illness that Lazarus had wouldn't lead to his death. But then Jesus does something rather unusual. He stays away intentionally for 2 days. You see, Jesus had a plan here. He stays away for 2 more days, knowing that Lazarus is sick. And then he decides to go to Mary, Martha, and Lazarus' house. He tells his disciples, "I'm going to go to Lazarus' house. Our friend Lazarus is asleep." Now, when Jesus said that, asleep, that was a Jewish euphemism, meaning dead. The disciples really didn't understand what he was saying, so he had to tell them plainly, "Our friend Lazarus is dead." And I'm glad I wasn't there, so that you, my disciples, might believe. Well, I'm sure that the disciples were left confused by that statement. And I am sure that Mary and Martha were disappointed that Jesus never came to heal Lazarus. Besides, what kind of friend does that? Knows that somebody's sick, but doesn't do anything about it. Well, Jesus does go to Mary and Martha's house. And as he meets them, both of them say to him, "Lord, if you had been here, our brother wouldn't have died." Mary is particularly bereft over Lazarus' death, and she begins to cry. And the more that she weeps, the more impact it has on Jesus. And soon, Jesus starts to cry. In fact, this is that one verse in the Bible that everybody talks about being the shortest verse in the Bible. It's just 2 words. It says, Jesus wept. Well, Mary, Martha, and Jesus, they go to Lazarus' tomb. Jesus commands that they roll away the stone from the tomb. But Mary and Martha, they warn him. They say to him, Jesus, he's been dead for 4 days now, and there's going to be a very strong odor in there. Well, before Jesus does anything else, he says a prayer to his Father. He thanks the Father for Lazarus and even for Lazarus' death. He says, thank you, because I want them to be able to believe, Lord, that you sent me. After saying that prayer, Jesus calls Lazarus from the tomb and brings him back to life. It's an amazing story. Well, there's some things I notice about this story. The first thing I notice is this. Jesus didn't allow Lazarus to die as some sort of punishment for something Lazarus might have done wrong. You know, sometimes as Christians, we think that way. We think, oh, God is punishing me. Or in some cases, God has brought about the death of somebody because of something bad they've done. No, Jesus did what he did in allowing Lazarus to die so that people, including his own disciples, would know that Jesus had been sent into our world by the Father. You know what else I notice about this is God's plan for our life is much bigger than we ever know. It was for Lazarus, it was for Mary and Martha, and it was for me also. I didn't think anything about moving from our west side Arthur Treachers to our east side Arthur Treachers, but you know what? God had a plan. God knew that I needed to be at the east side Arthur Treachers so that I could come to faith in Jesus. You know something? Lazarus would die twice. He died the first time so that others might experience the glory of God in their lives. You see, when Jesus did that miracle of raising Lazarus from the dead, people saw the glory of God. The last thing I observe about this story is that Jesus is moved by our grief. He wept when he saw Mary weeping. The thing I want us to understand is that your broken heart and my broken heart matters to God. You know, I was preparing to become a chaplain. I was doing my chaplain residency at Ohio Health Hospitals, and I'd spent 8 months working at Riverside Hospital. Part of my responsibility was the brain and stroke unit. And I was making rounds one day on that unit. I came to a patient's door, knocked on the door, and stepped in. And here was a man in his 70s, lying in bed, and his son, who was probably in his 50s, was sitting in a chair beside the bed. And I introduced myself. When I introduced myself, both of them became quite angry. I wondered what I had done wrong. They'd raised their voices, there was some profanity, and they began to tell me their story. You see, they had lived in a smaller community outside of Columbus, and this father, this man in his 70s, had had a number of strokes, and he had gone to the local hospital. And at that local, smaller hospital, they told him there really wasn't much they could do for him, but that they were going to send him to Riverside Hospital because the doctors there would be able to help him. And when he arrived at Riverside Hospital and the doctors examined him, the doctors said to him, "There's nothing we can do to help you." Well, you might understand that this man, this father and his son, were both angry over that. I affirmed their feelings, and I said to them I would be praying for them, and I left. The next day, I came back for another visit, and just the father, the patient, was in the room. He was seated in a chair beside the bed, and there was an empty chair next to him. I knocked on the door again, reintroduced myself, and asked if it was all right if I came in. He said, sure. I came in, and he offered me a seat, and I sat down right next to him. And as I sat there and talked to him, he began to share with me how his wife had gone through this exact thing just a couple years ago, and how she had passed away. And he was now afraid that he was going to die also. Well, I learned something from that encounter in the hospital during my chaplain residency. Kind of goes along with the story about Lazarus. You know what? God wants to enter our story. He wants to enter into our sadness and our grief. And he wants us to do the same thing with others. He wants us to be part of their life, part of their sadness, part of their grief. He wants us to be part of what breaks their heart, knowing that God has a bigger plan than any of us can see. I hope you understand that your broken heart matters to God if you're a person that has a broken heart. God cares about you, cares about me. He cares about what's going on in our world right now, because there's a lot of broken-hearted people in our world. And I hope you will allow yourself, if God leads you, to enter into somebody's life who's suffering from a broken heart and be the help that they need. God bless you until the next time.